close your eyes for a moment. Imagine King David. The images that most people conjure up are familiar, even comforting. A pale-skinned, noble young man with flowing hair, carved into marble by Michelangelo, or painted in oils on a grand Renaissance canvas. Perhaps he stands as the heroic shepherd boy who felled Goliath with a sling, the wise and poetic king who united Israel, the forefather of Jesus himself. These images are etched into the cultural consciousness of the Western world, repeated in classrooms, churches, and museums. They are so deeply ingrained that imagining David otherwise feels almost radical, almost subversive. But what if all of this is wrong? What if the King David of history was nothing like the European ideal that has dominated the imagination for centuries? What if the Bible itself, the text that tells his story, hints at a man whose heritage and appearance were far more complex than we have been led to believe? To uncover this, we must begin where every investigation into David's life must begin, with the genealogies that trace his lineage, a detailed map of human connections that reveal the diverse threads woven into the fabric of his family. The Western imagination often assumes a neat, uniform line of pure-blooded Israelites stretching back through time, but the biblical text refuses to comply with such simplicity. On the contrary, the genealogy of David is remarkable for its inclusion of women, a rare emphasis in a patriarchal society where lineage, inheritance, and identity were almost exclusively traced through men. And it is these women, Rahab and Ruth, who provide the first clues to David's complex Afro-Levantine heritage. Rahab, the Canaanite woman mentioned in the book of Joshua, is a figure whose story has fascinated scholars for centuries. She was no anonymous footnote. She was a resident of Jericho, a city deeply entwined with Egyptian influence. In the late Bronze Age, Canaan was not a quiet backwater, isolated from the powers of the world. It was under Egyptian domination, a land crisscrossed with trade routes, garrisoned by foreign soldiers, and influenced culturally, economically, and genetically by the African kingdom of the Nile. By including Rahab in the genealogy that ultimately leads to David, the biblical authors were placing their hero in a world that was already multicultural, already connected to Africa, already shaped by the interactions of diverse peoples. Rahab was not an exception. She was a symbol of the international and interwoven roots of the Israelite people, and by extension, of David himself. Then there is Ruth, the Moabite woman, whose story occupies an entire book of the Bible. Moab, located east of the Jordan River in what is now modern-day Jordan, was a kingdom that frequently clashed with Israelite neighbors. Deuteronomy even contains laws that restrict Moabites from entering the assembly of the Lord, a testament to their status as outsiders. Yet Ruth, through her loyalty and faith, marries Boaz, an Israelite, and becomes the great-grandmother of David. Her presence in the genealogy is not incidental. It is a deliberate acknowledgement of a lineage that is far from homogeneous. Ruth's Moabite heritage underscores the theme that the line of Israel's greatest king was not insular, but inclusive, reflecting a world in which ethnicity was fluid and identities intertwined. This is a pattern repeated again and again in the Bible. God's plan does not privilege purity of blood, but embraces a broader, more cosmopolitan vision of humanity. But to understand why this matters, we must consider the world in which David's ancestors lived. The Levant, a narrow strip of land bridging Africa and Asia, was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and peoples. Egyptian influence extended deeply into the region, leaving indelible marks on administration, religion, art, and daily life. Trade routes connected the Levant to Africa, Mesopotamia, and beyond, and population movement was constant. Recent genetic studies of ancient populations from this region confirm what historians have long suspected. The Levant was never homogeneous. People from Africa, the Near East, and even as far as the Zagros Mountains mingled, married, and shared ancestry. This is the world into which David was born, a world of movement and mixture, of complex identities that defy simple racial categorization. When we examine David's ancestry in this context, the narrative begins to shift dramatically. The inclusion of Rahab and Ruth signals that David's heritage was not only Levantine, but Afro-Levantine, connecting him to African populations through generations of trade, migration, and intermarriage. This heritage was not hidden in ancient texts. It was celebrated, encoded in stories that emphasized the divine plan, working through people of diverse backgrounds. The erasure of this heritage comes much later, a product of cultural, religious, and artistic processes that sought to reshape biblical history for new audiences. Consider the significance of this inclusion from a narrative standpoint. In a time when kingship and power were often justified through notions of pure lineage, the biblical authors deliberately highlight ancestors who are outsiders, women whose backgrounds would have marked them as foreign or even forbidden. The message is radical. God's plan transcends human notions of race, ethnicity, and national identity. David is not the product of isolation. He is the culmination of a rich, interwoven tapestry of peoples, a living testament to the interconnectedness of the ancient world. This is the first piece of the story that has been systematically erased in Western imagination, replaced by a vision of David that conforms to European ideals rather than historical reality. To understand the full implications, it helps to visualize the Levant, as it was in David's time. Imagine the city of Jericho, a fortified settlement surrounded by fertile plains, bustling with trade caravans that brought goods from Egypt, Africa, and Mesopotamia. Soldiers, merchants, artisans, and farmers of diverse backgrounds move through its streets. The air is filled with the sounds of multiple languages, Canaanite dialects, Egyptian officials issuing orders, traders calling across market stalls. This was a world of multicultural interaction, a crossroads of continents and civilizations. Rahab lived here, and by integrating her into the ancestral line, the biblical authors were embedding David into a world that was vibrant, diverse, and intimately connected to Africa. Ruth, in Moab, inhabited a similarly complex society. The desert landscapes and river valleys of the region were home to populations that engaged in trade and conflict with neighboring Israel, Edom, and the broader Levantine network. Her story, chronicled with care and reverence, underscores that the path to kingship in Israel did not come from isolation or ethnic purity. Instead, it emerged from networks of loyalty, faith, and cross-cultural interaction. When she marries Boaz, when her loyalty and virtues are celebrated, the narrative is making a profound statement. The foundations of Israel's monarchy were not racially exclusive, but inclusively constructed from a diverse set of lineages, each contributing to the identity of the king who would follow. Now, imagine the young David growing up in Bethlehem. The town is modest, tucked into the rolling hills of Judah. He is a shepherd, accustomed to the rhythms of the land, intimately familiar with the soil, the skies, and the flocks he tends. His lineage, inherited through both the women and men of his family, connects him to the broader Levant and its African influences. This is not the image of a Europeanized prince. It is the image of a boy who carries within him the genetic, cultural, and spiritual legacy of a region that has always been at the crossroads of continents. This historical context also changes how we interpret the biblical stories themselves. When David faces Goliath, when he unites the tribes of Israel, when he composes psalms that speak of God's majesty and justice, he is acting within a world shaped by intercultural exchange, negotiation, and conflict. His triumphs are not just military or spiritual. They are emblematic of the synthesis of identities, the bridging of worlds, and the unifying potential of diverse lineages. This is a David who is profoundly human, complex, and representative of the interconnected ancient world, rather than a sanitized, Europeanized hero of later imagination. Yet despite this rich, historically grounded picture, the dominant Western narrative has consistently minimized or erased these aspects of David's identity. Over centuries, as Christianity spread through Europe, David's image was altered to reflect the aesthetic and cultural norms of the societies that venerated him. Artistic, religious, and political forces combined to replace the historical Afro-Levantine king with an idealized European version. This process, as we will explore, was neither immediate nor accidental. It unfolded over centuries, shaped by theology, cultural projection, and later, the rise of Europe as a global power. Before we move forward, we must confront the tension at the heart of this story. How can a figure so central to the Bible, so foundational to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, have been systematically transformed in the collective imagination? The answer lies partly in genealogy, partly in geography, and partly in the human tendency to see the divine in one's own image. By understanding the true multi-ethnic roots of David, we are not merely correcting a historical record. We are uncovering a story about power, identity, and the ways in which cultural narratives are constructed, maintained, and sometimes distorted. This is the hidden heritage of King David, a boy from Bethlehem whose bloodline bridges the Levant and Africa, whose ancestry includes outsiders celebrated for their faith and courage, whose life was intertwined with the rich cultural currents of his time. It is a heritage that has been obscured by centuries of art, translation, and ideology. But by returning to the genealogical and historical evidence, we can begin to see the contours of the true David, a man shaped by the complex and beautiful tapestry of the ancient Afro-Levantine world. And as we begin to explore the language, the translations, and the choices made over centuries, we will see how every brushstroke, every word, every artistic and theological decision contributed to the erasure of this heritage. The story of David is not just a story of one man. It is the story of how history, art, and culture can conspire to hide truths that are inconvenient, complex, or challenging to prevailing narratives. By reclaiming David's heritage, we reclaim a piece of history that has been waiting for centuries to be told. A history that speaks not only to the past, but to the ways we understand identity, faith, and the interconnectedness of humanity today. To truly understand King David, one must step beyond the images and the genealogy, beyond the marble statues and the carefully curated paintings, and into the world of language itself, the world in which words carry meaning, nuance, and cultural weight that is often lost in translation. Language is not neutral. It shapes perception, guides imagination, and in some cases serves as a tool of erasure. And nowhere is this more evident than in the biblical Hebrew word admoni, the term used to describe David when the prophet Samuel first encounters him as a young man in the fields of Bethlehem. The King James Version of the Bible, one of the most influential English translations of all time, renders 1 Samuel 16:12 as follows: "Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to." That single word, ruddy, has been doing an extraordinary amount of work for centuries. It has carried the weight of European imagination, painting a picture of rosy-cheeked youth, fair-skinned, healthy, and unmistakably Northern European in appearance. Across the Western world, countless readers have internalized this image without questioning its origin or accuracy. It has shaped not just theology, but visual culture, inspiring artists to depict David as a figure who could seamlessly blend into Renaissance Florence or Baroque Rome. But the Hebrew word behind this translation is admoni, and when one examines it closely, its meaning is far more complex, far more rooted in the land and people of David's own time than the English word ruddy can convey. The root of admoni is Adam, the same word used for man, for the first human, Adam, and the root for adma, meaning earth or soil. It is intimately connected with the word for blood, dam, dasnoi. These linguistic connections tie David's description directly to the physical world of his homeland, the reddish-brown earth of Judah, the rich soil from which generations of Levantine peoples had drawn their sustenance. Admoni is not a casual descriptor. It is an earthy, evocative word that situates David in his environment, linking his physical appearance to the soil, the land, and by extension, the people of the Levant. To appreciate how translation can transform perception, it is necessary to compare Admoni with its other biblical usage. One of the most famous applications of the word appears in Genesis, describing Esau, the elder twin brother of Jacob. Esau is born Admoni, a reddish figure, clothed metaphorically in the ruggedness of the desert. The text does not imply he is pale or European. He is earthy, robust, and tied to the land of Edom, which itself means red. The same word, applied to David, should logically carry similar connotations, and yet translators centuries later, steeped in Eurocentric cultural norms, rendered David as ruddy, implying a delicate, fair-skinned youth rather than a young man whose complexion reflected the land and the heritage of his people. This discrepancy is not accidental. It reveals the subtle yet powerful ways in which language, translation, and cultural bias shape historical perception. Translators were not neutral conduits of meaning. They were participants in a cultural project. The choice to describe David as ruddy, rather than something closer to earthy or reddish-brown, was an interpretive act, one informed by the worldview of the translators and the society in which they lived. It reflected a desire to see biblical heroes in familiar, comforting images, images that conform to European norms rather than historical realities. Language, of course, does more than describe physical appearance. It shapes narrative and identity. The Bible is full of nuanced terms that carry multiple layers of meaning, often lost or simplified in translation. Consider, for instance, the Hebrew word tov, frequently translated as good. In the context of biblical description, tov conveys not only moral goodness, but also aesthetic, functional, and spiritual excellence. When applied to David, the phrase goodly to look to carries this depth. It is not merely a statement about physical attractiveness, but a recognition of his overall suitability, his harmony with divine intention, and his connection to the natural and social world around him. To translate this as a superficial compliment to appearance is to flatten a rich, culturally embedded meaning. The act of translation, then, is not neutral. It is a choice, a lens through which history is filtered. Every time a translator made a decision about which words to use, they shaped the perception of David for generations. They chose words that aligned with European ideals of beauty, power, and divine favor, effectively transforming a Semitic, Afro-Levantine king into a figure who could be imagined within a European context. Over centuries, this process repeated itself as translators, theologians, and artists reinforced the same image across texts, paintings, and sculptures. The result was a powerful cultural narrative in which the historical David was rendered invisible, replaced by an idealized version that served the ideological and aesthetic needs of a European-dominated world. But language alone does not tell the whole story. To fully grasp David's world and his appearance, we must immerse ourselves in the living context of the time. Imagine the hills of Judah, the shepherding communities, the dusty paths winding between olive groves and small villages. The sun is harsh, casting deep shadows across the reddish soil. The people who live here, including David, are adapted to this environment. Their skin reflects the landscape, the climate, and the centuries of intermingling with neighboring populations. They carry the genetic legacy of the Levantine and Afro-Asiatic world, a mosaic of peoples whose physical features defy the rigid racial categories that would emerge much later in Europe. It is in this context that the meaning of Admoni becomes clear. It is not about European fairness. It is about belonging, rootedness, and the visible connection of a person to the land and the people among whom he lives. It evokes a connection to ancestry, geography, and culture that is far richer than any superficial descriptor of skin tone could convey. David is painted, in the original Hebrew, as a man who is of the earth itself, a living product of a region shaped by millennia of human migration, trade, and interaction with Africa, Mesopotamia, and beyond. To ignore this linguistic reality is to participate in a centuries-long act of erasure. For hundreds of years, translations, commentaries, and artistic interpretations have stripped David of his Afro-Levantine identity, replacing it with a version more palatable to European audiences. This is not merely a matter of aesthetics. It is a matter of cultural memory, power, and ideology. The words chosen by translators and the images chosen by artists reinforced one another, embedding a false image of David into the collective consciousness and obscuring the historical truth. Moreover, the manipulation of language is intimately tied to the manipulation of narrative. By presenting David as pale-skinned, translators and theologians subtly reinforced a broader pattern of disconnecting biblical history from its Middle Eastern and African roots. If David could be imagined as European, then the story of Israel, the life of Jesus, and the foundations of Christianity could all be reframed as belonging to a European-centered worldview. This linguistic shift paved the way for centuries of art, scholarship, and ideology that marginalized the true ethnic and geographic context of the Bible. The significance of this is profound. Language shapes imagination, imagination shapes belief, and belief shapes culture. When generations of readers internalized the image of a pale European David, they were not merely misled about the appearance of a historical figure, they were conditioned to perceive the sacred, the heroic, and the divine through a Eurocentric lens. The consequences extend far beyond art or theology. They influence how societies understand race, identity, and belonging, how they interpret sacred texts, and how they situate themselves within the story of human history. Even within the Hebrew Bible, there is a pattern that underscores the universality of this issue. When describing figures like Esau or other non-Israelite peoples, the biblical text consistently employs descriptors that convey earthiness, physicality, and connection to the land. The inconsistency with David suggests a deliberate choice in translation, one that was motivated not by ambiguity in the original Hebrew, but by cultural preferences and ideological considerations. It is a choice that has resonated across centuries, shaping perceptions of biblical history and influencing the visual arts, literature, and theology in profound ways. This is why understanding Admoni and other key terms is not an academic exercise. It is central to reclaiming the historical David. To see him accurately, we must allow the language to guide us, to respect the cultural and geographic context embedded in the Hebrew text, and to challenge the assumptions imposed by centuries of translation and artistic reinterpretation. By doing so, we begin to uncover the historical reality of a king whose appearance, heritage, and identity reflect the Afro-Levantine world in which he lived. A world that was vibrant, interconnected, and profoundly different from the Europeanized vision that dominates popular imagination. The power of words, then, is immense. A single word, translated in a particular way, can shape millennia of perception, influence art and theology, and even participate in the construction of racial hierarchies. In the case of David, the choice to render Admoni as ruddy was not merely a linguistic decision, it was a cultural intervention, one that obscured historical truth and facilitated a broader pattern of erasure that would extend through art, colonialism, and the global spread of Christianity. As we continue this investigation, it becomes clear that the erasure of David's Afro-Levantine identity is not a matter of accident or oversight. It is deeply embedded in the choices of translators, commentators, and artists, whose interpretations have echoed across centuries. By returning to the original language, by attending to the subtleties of Hebrew and the context of the Levant, we can begin to dismantle the false image and restore David to his historical reality, a boy of Judah, descended from diverse lineages, whose very appearance connected him to the land and its people, and whose story reflects the richness of a multicultural Afro-Asiatic world. Language is the key that unlocks this history. By understanding it, we gain access to a reality that has been hidden beneath layers of translation, bias, and Eurocentric imagination. The words of the Bible, when read with care and attention to context, reveal a King David who is at once familiar and radically different from the image imposed by centuries of art and ideology. He is not a figure of European fantasy. He is a man of the ancient Levant, a product of interwoven lineages, the soil of his homeland, and the complex cultural currents that shape the Near East. And as we move forward into archaeology, art, and cultural history, we will see how these linguistic choices set the stage for visual and ideological transformations that cemented the whitewashed David in global consciousness. The story of translation is inseparable from the story of erasure. The words we inherit shape the images we create, and the images we create, in turn, shape how generations imagine the past, interpret sacred texts, and understand themselves. By reclaiming the language, we reclaim the truth. By reclaiming the truth, we reclaim King David. Understanding King David and his world requires more than examining language, translation, or genealogy. To truly reconstruct the historical reality, we must turn to the ground itself, to the soil, the ruins, the artifacts and inscriptions that bear witness to the lives of the people who inhabited the Levant over 3,000 years ago. Archaeology allows us to move beyond imagination, beyond centuries of European reinterpretation, and into a physical, tangible world, a world in which David and his ancestors lived, fought, ruled, and worshipped. For much of modern history, the academic debate about David's existence itself was contentious. Early to mid-20th century scholars, influenced by a school of thought known as biblical minimalism, often regarded David as a largely legendary figure. They argued that the biblical narrative was a theological construction created to establish a glorious past for Israel, rather than a historical record. In this view, David was akin to King Arthur or Romulus, a symbolic hero rather than a flesh-and-blood king. These scholars suggested that excavating sites associated with David could never yield definitive proof because his story was mythologized, embellished, and constructed long after the events supposedly occurred. Then, in the summer of 1993, a discovery fundamentally changed the debate and reshaped our understanding of David as a historical figure. At the site of Tel Dan, in northern Israel, archaeologists unearthed a fragment of a black basalt stele inscribed in Aramaic. This stele, now famously known as the Tel Dan stele, was a victory monument commissioned by an Aramean king, likely Hazael of Damascus, boasting of his military campaigns against Israel and its neighbors. Most strikingly, it included the phrase House of David, the first unambiguous reference to David outside of the biblical text. Suddenly, David was no longer confined to Scripture. His dynasty, his very lineage, had been acknowledged by an enemy king in an archaeological record dating to roughly 150 years after his purported reign. The Tel Dan stele is more than a fragment of stone. It is a keystone connecting historical reality to biblical narrative. Its importance cannot be overstated. It confirms that the Davidic dynasty was recognized in the Levant, that David was remembered as a significant figure with an enduring political legacy, and that the biblical accounts of his reign were grounded, at least partially, in historical events. The stela's language also underscores that David was a figure embedded in the socio-political world of the 10th century BCE southern Levant, a region defined by interaction, trade, conflict, and cultural blending between Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Africa. The archaeological record does not stop at Tel Dan. Across Judah and Israel, excavations at sites such as Khirbet Kiafa, Beth Shemesh, and in Jerusalem itself have revealed structures fortifications, and artifacts consistent with the biblical descriptions of a centralized monarchy during David's time. Khirbet Kiafa, located strategically near the Elah Valley, has been interpreted by many scholars as a fortified city from the late 11th or early 10th century BCE. Its massive stone walls, organized urban planning, and inscriptions indicate a level of political complexity consistent with the emergence of a kingdom that could plausibly have been ruled by David. These excavations also shed light on the people of David's world. Pottery styles, architectural layouts, and inscriptions reveal a multicultural, interconnected society. Trade routes carried not only goods but ideas, religious practices, and technologies from Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. The material culture points to a population accustomed to cultural exchange, migration, and intermarriage. A population far more complex than the homogeneous, Eurocentric images popularized in later centuries. David's world was not an isolated European-like kingdom. It was a vibrant Afro-Asiatic crossroads. Genetic studies of ancient remains from the Levant provide yet another layer of evidence. By examining mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and other genetic signatures in skeletal remains, scientists have traced the movement of peoples across the region for thousands of years. These studies show a long history of mixing between local Levantine populations and groups from Africa, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia. They confirm what the archaeological and historical record already suggested, that the population David belonged to was diverse, with physical traits that reflected centuries of cross-cultural interaction. Consider the implications of this evidence for David's appearance. A Northern European depiction, a fair-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired figure, is not just unlikely, it is incompatible with the demographics, genetics, and material culture of the southern Levant in the 10th century BCE. The physical reality of David's environment suggests a man with olive to darker skin tones, dark hair, and features common among Levantine populations. His ancestry, influenced by his Moabite great-grandmother Ruth and Canaanite ancestors like Rahab, would have contributed to this multi-ethnic appearance, further reinforcing the historical plausibility of an Afro-Levantine David. Archaeology also allows us to contextualize David within the political and military realities of his time. The biblical narrative frequently highlights his prowess as a warrior and statesman. Archaeological evidence corroborates a society organized around fortified cities, strategic control points, and an economy capable of sustaining a royal household. Sites like Megiddo, Hazor, and Lachish reveal fortifications and administrative structures that reflect hierarchical governance. David, as described in Scripture, would have been operating in a world where kingship required both martial skill and administrative acumen, qualities consistent with the archaeological record. Another critical aspect of the material evidence is the evidence for religious life. The Levant was home to diverse religious practices and sacred spaces long before and during David's reign. High places, shrines, and early temples discovered at various sites show a blend of Canaanite, Israelite, and Egyptian influences. This reflects a complex spiritual landscape in which David's own religious reforms, as described in biblical texts, would have been situated. It also reinforces the idea that the people and rulers of this region were neither European nor monolithic. Their cultural identity was a product of interaction across Afro-Asiatic worlds. The intersection of archaeology, genetics, and linguistics paints a coherent picture. David is situated in a historically plausible context, a man of the southern Levant, part of a kingdom emerging in a culturally rich and diverse region, connected through blood, trade, and politics to a broader Afro-Asiatic world. Every excavation, inscription, and genetic study supports the conclusion that the Europeanized image of David is historically and geographically implausible. It is also worth considering how the material record interacts with art and cultural memory. Michelangelo's David, the Renaissance paintings, and countless illustrations depict a hero who belongs to a European imagination rather than a historical reality. Archaeology, in contrast, provides a counter-narrative rooted in evidence, challenging the centuries of visual and textual whitewashing that have shaped global perceptions. By returning to the ground, literally, the story of David is rerouted in the Levant, in the communities, landscapes, and lineages that truly formed him. Even minor artifacts contribute to this reconstruction. Everyday tools, pottery, inscriptions, and even dietary remnants provide insight into the daily life of David's world. The way houses were built, the use of olive oil and wine, and the types of grain cultivated all reflect environmental adaptation and cultural exchange. These details humanize the biblical figures, grounding them in a real-world context that Europeanized imagery often abstracts or ignores. David was not a marble ideal. He was a living person navigating the social, political, and environmental realities of his time. Archaeology also reveals the broader geopolitical context. The Levant during David's time was a crossroads, contested by larger powers such as Egypt and Mesopotamia. Military campaigns, diplomatic marriages, and trade agreements shaped the region's social fabric. David's lineage, including his Canaanite and Moabite ancestors, reflects this interconnected world. Archaeological evidence of Egyptian garrisons and administrative centers in Canaan, for example, underscores the significant African influence in the region. It is a tangible reminder that the Levant was never isolated, and that the people who lived there, including David, were part of an Afro-Asiatic cultural milieu. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of archaeology is its resistance to ideological manipulation. While art and translation can be influenced by cultural biases, stones, inscriptions, and skeletal remains do not lie. The Tel Dan stele, the fortifications of Khirbet Qiyafah, and the genetic record collectively provide independent corroboration of David's existence, his kingdom, and the multicultural reality of his ancestry. In doing so, they challenge centuries of artistic and theological revisionism, offering a more accurate, evidence-based understanding of David's identity. It is important to recognize that archaeology is not just about proving existence. It is about reconstructing a world. The material evidence allows us to visualize the landscape, the urban centers, the political structures, and the daily life of the people who lived alongside David. It situates him within a historical continuum, connecting the biblical text to a tangible past. By doing so, it restores the complexity, nuance, and humanity of a figure who has been flattened by centuries of Europeanization. In sum, archaeology transforms our understanding of David from a mythologized European icon back into a historical Afro-Levantine figure. Every excavation, inscription, and artifact reinforces the narrative constructed from genealogical and linguistic analysis. David was a product of his time, his place, and his people. He was a man rooted in the land of Judah, descended from a diverse lineage that reflected the multicultural realities of the ancient Near East. He was shaped by the politics, warfare, and cultural exchanges of the Levant, a region that connected Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. The archaeological record, therefore, is not just a supplement to the biblical text. It is a corrective. It challenges centuries of assumptions, counters the Eurocentric visual imagination, and provides concrete, empirical evidence of a historical reality that had long been obscured. By embracing this evidence, we gain a fuller, richer understanding of David's identity, appearance, and context, a world in which he was not a pale European knight, but a vibrant, Afro-Levantine king whose legacy continues to resonate across millennia. In the next section, we will examine how this historical and archaeological understanding intersects with art, theology, and global cultural narratives. We will trace the transformation of David's image from a man of the Levant to a Europeanized icon, exploring the deliberate and unconscious processes that have shaped collective imagination for centuries. Through this exploration, we will see how evidence, language, and art converge to tell a story not only about King David, but about power, identity, and the control of historical memory itself. While archaeology and genetics reconnect King David to his Afro-Levantine roots, the history of art tells a different story, a story of transformation, appropriation, and cultural projection that has shaped the way the world has imagined David for centuries. Art is not just decoration, it is a vehicle of memory, ideology, and identity. When we look at centuries of paintings, sculptures, and illustrations, we are not simply seeing representations of historical figures. We are seeing the values, anxieties, and aspirations of the societies that created them. And in the case of David, what we see is the construction of a European hero who bears little resemblance to the man whose genealogy and language we have traced through scripture and whose existence archaeology confirms. The erasure of David's authentic appearance did not happen overnight. It was a slow, multi-generational process that began long before the Renaissance and continued through the colonial era. From the early Christian communities of the Mediterranean to the cathedral workshops of Northern Europe, David was gradually remade in the image of the artists and patrons who revered him, or, more accurately, in their own image. In the early centuries of Christianity, visual depictions of biblical figures were scarce. The religion, often under persecution, relied more on oral storytelling, symbolic art, and simple iconography than on grand depictions. When David was represented, it was often in small-scale mosaics, illuminated manuscripts, or carvings that focused on his role as a biblical hero rather than his physical appearance. Even then, the imagery was symbolic. David as a shepherd, a musician, or a victorious warrior was more important than whether he resembled the historical man of Bethlehem. However, as Christianity transitioned from a persecuted faith to the state religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, art became a more powerful tool for visual communication and cultural assertion. Churches, basilicas, and public spaces were adorned with mosaics and frescoes depicting biblical narratives. By this time, Christianity had begun to expand into Europe, and its followers increasingly projected their own ethnic and cultural identity onto its figures. Biblical heroes were no longer imagined as Middle Eastern men. They were increasingly rendered with the features of local populations. The theological justification for this transformation is complex. Supersessionism, or replacement theology, argued that the Christian church had supplanted Israel as God's chosen people. This doctrine, articulated by influential church fathers like Justin Martyr, Origen, and Augustine, implicitly encouraged the visual reimagining of biblical figures as ancestors of the Christian church rather than representatives of the historical Israelites. If the Old Testament heroes were now part of a Christian lineage, it became not only permissible but ideologically convenient to render them in the likeness of European Christians. This gradual transformation accelerated during the Middle Ages. As European cities grew in wealth and influence, the production of religious art became more sophisticated and widespread. Cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and devotional paintings depicted biblical figures with increasingly Europeanized features, fair skin, light hair, and often blue or green eyes. David appeared not as a young shepherd of Judah, but as a chivalric knight or princely figure who reflected the ideals of medieval nobility. One of the key factors in this transformation was the intersection of art with political and civic identity. In cities like Florence, Siena, and Paris, patrons of the arts were often powerful civic leaders who used biblical imagery to assert authority and legitimacy. By commissioning depictions of David that mirrored the physical appearance and virtues of local elites, patrons reinforced the idea that the heroes of Scripture were not distant figures of the Levant, but ancestral icons whose values and appearance resonated with contemporary European society. The transformation reached its zenith during the Renaissance, a period marked by a revival of classical ideals, humanism, and the study of anatomy and proportion. Michelangelo Buonarroti's monumental sculpture of David, completed between 1501 and 1504, is perhaps the most famous example of this process. Michelangelo's David is a marvel of artistic skill, a 17-foot-tall figure carved from a single block of Carrara marble, embodying the ideals of Greek and Roman aesthetics. Every muscle, vein, and sinew is rendered with precision. The contrapposto stance evokes balance and movement. The proportions reflect a classical ideal of human perfection. But Michelangelo's David is not the David of Scripture. He is a Europeanized hero, a product of Florentine culture, Renaissance humanism, and classical revival. He has no ethnic markers that would situate him in the southern Levant or the Afro-Asiatic world. He is pale, sculpted with smooth features, and idealized to a degree that obscures the rougher, more ethnically diverse realities of ancient Judah. Yet because Michelangelo's David was placed prominently in Florence's public square and celebrated as a civic symbol, it became the template for how the Western world imagined King David for centuries to come. The influence of Renaissance and post-Renaissance art on the perception of biblical figures cannot be overstated. Painters like Raphael, Titian, Caravaggio, and Rubens continued to depict David as a European ideal. They borrowed from Michelangelo's template, reinforcing the visual narrative of a white, noble, heroic figure. David's African and Canaanite lineage, the reddish-brown complexion indicated by Admani, and the multi-ethnic context of his ancestry were systematically erased, replaced by a homogeneous, idealized European image. Art served as a medium to naturalize the idea that the heroes of Scripture, and by extension God's favor, were aligned with European identity. By visually claiming these figures, European culture asserted spiritual, moral, and even racial authority. The white David became not just an aesthetic choice, but a symbol of cultural supremacy, subtly reinforcing social hierarchies and the sense of Europe as the inheritor of divine legacy. The global impact of this whitewashing became apparent during the colonial era. European powers exported not only their armies and governance structures, but also their religious culture. Missionaries, colonists, and settlers carried with them Bibles, printed illustrations, and church iconography that presented a white Jesus, white Abraham, and white David. Indigenous populations in Africa, the Americas, and Asia were taught to internalize this imagery as natural, normative, and divinely sanctioned. In doing so, these visual narratives reinforced colonial hierarchies, implicitly associating divinity, virtue, and civilization with whiteness. Consider the case of African slaves in the Americas. The portrayal of a white David and a white Jesus in churches and illustrated Bibles served as a constant, unspoken reminder of European dominance. By erasing the historical realities of figures like David, figures with direct connections to Africa and the Middle East, European culture reinforced the message that power, spiritual favor, and cultural centrality belonged to them alone. The real historically grounded David descended from Canaanites, Moabites, and Levantine peoples, presented a narrative of shared humanity and diversity that was inconvenient for a society structured around racial hierarchy. Even within Europe, the artistic erasure of David's authentic features shaped theology and scholarship. Artists, theologians, and historians increasingly assumed a Europeanized David as the baseline, rarely questioning the discrepancy between historical reality and visual representation. This assumption filtered into educational materials, devotional literature, and eventually popular culture. From Sunday school illustrations to biblical films, the white David became a self-reinforcing icon, shaping collective memory and public consciousness. It is also important to recognize the interplay between visual culture and language. Just as translations of Admani skewed toward Northern European ideals, artistic representations cemented those interpretations visually. When audiences repeatedly saw David as fair-skinned, muscular, and European, it became psychologically easier to accept linguistic interpretations that aligned with this image. Art and translation together created a feedback loop that erased historical context, and reinforced a Eurocentric worldview. Yet not all depictions conform to this pattern. In some regions and periods, local artistic traditions retained elements of Middle Eastern, African, or Mediterranean identity in their biblical illustrations. Eastern Orthodox iconography, Ethiopian Christian art, and Coptic manuscripts offer glimpses of a David more aligned with his historical and geographic context. Olive to brown skin, dark hair, and features consistent with Afro-Levantine ancestry. These artistic traditions remind us that the whitewashed European David is not the only possible representation. It is a culturally specific construction, not a historical inevitability. The contrast between these artistic traditions and Western European art underscores the ideological nature of the transformation. Where European artists projected their own image onto David, other Christian cultures maintained representations that reflected local ethnic and geographic realities. The European narrative of David, however, became dominant globally due to the political, economic, and cultural reach of Europe, solidifying in the collective imagination as the default David. The story of art and whitewashing teaches a critical lesson. Visual culture is never neutral. It carries power, shapes identity, and can erase or distort historical truth. In the case of David, art has obscured a rich and complex reality, a king with multi-ethnic ancestry, a reddish-brown complexion, and deep ties to the Afro-Levantine world. Recognizing this distortion allows us not only to reclaim a more accurate historical understanding, but also to confront the ways visual culture influences perceptions of race, authority, and belonging. Today, efforts to restore David's authentic image are gaining momentum. Scholars, historians, and artists are revisiting ancient texts, archaeological findings, and linguistic evidence to challenge the centuries-old Eurocentric narrative. Museums, documentaries, and academic publications increasingly acknowledge the diversity of biblical figures and the historical context from which they emerged. By highlighting the Afro-Levantine reality of David, these efforts counteract the visual and ideological erasure that has dominated Western culture for half a millennium. The reconstruction of David in art is not simply an academic exercise. It is a corrective for centuries of misrepresentation, a reclamation of cultural heritage, and a challenge to deeply ingrained assumptions about race, history, and power. By examining how David was transformed in art, from symbolic early Christian depictions to the monumental Renaissance sculpture and beyond, we gain insight into how societies control memory, manipulate identity, and project their values onto history. We also gain a clearer understanding of who David was. Not a European ideal, but a real man of the southern Levant, shaped by the cultural, political, and genetic diversity of his time. The story of art and whitewashing is intertwined with the story of colonialism, theology, and European self-conception. Michelangelo's David, while a masterpiece of human creativity, simultaneously represents the culmination of a centuries-long process of cultural and racial erasure. Understanding this duality allows us to appreciate the genius of Renaissance art, while also critically interrogating the ways visual culture can obscure historical truth. By examining the artistic erasure of David's Afro-Levantine identity, we begin to see the larger pattern at play. History and culture are often filtered through the lens of power. Those who control the means of representation, whether through art, literature, or media, can redefine reality, shape collective memory, and marginalize alternative narratives. The European David is not simply a figure of aesthetic beauty, it is a symbol of authority, identity, and the capacity of culture to rewrite the past. In the next section, we will explore how these visual narratives intersected with colonial expansion and global ideology, further amplifying the whitewashed image of David on a worldwide scale. We will trace the journey of this image from European cathedrals to missionary schools, from illustrated Bibles to the global imagination, revealing how a historical figure rooted in the Levant became a tool for cultural and racial hierarchy, and how the truth of his Afro-Levantine identity continues to challenge that narrative today. As the European image of David solidified in Renaissance art, it did not remain confined to Florence or even to Europe. This image became a central instrument in shaping perceptions of race, divinity, and cultural authority across the world. With the onset of the Age of Exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, European powers extended their reach to Africa, the Americas, and Asia, carrying with them not just military might and mercantile ambition, but also a carefully curated vision of Christian history. In this vision, David the shepherd, warrior and king of Israel, was no longer a man of the Levant. He had become a European icon, a mirror of the conqueror's own identity, and a visual standard against which the rest of the world was measured. Missionaries, explorers, and colonizers were instrumental in spreading this whitewashed David across continents. Churches, schools, and public institutions in the New World and colonies in Africa and Asia were adorned with frescoes, statues, and illustrations depicting a pale-skinned, idealized David. The cumulative effect of these images was profound. Communities unfamiliar with the historical Levant were taught to associate God's favor, virtue, and leadership with European features. The implicit, unspoken message was clear. The chosen of God were white, noble, and European. David, once a son of a multi-ethnic Levantine lineage, became a visual and ideological instrument to reinforce European supremacy. The use of David in colonial ideology intersected with a broader agenda of racial hierarchies and social control. The European colonizers did not merely transport material culture. They transported a narrative that intertwined race with morality, civilization, and divine favor. Within this framework, whiteness was positioned as the natural inheritor of spiritual, intellectual, and political authority. Religious imagery, including depictions of David, provided theological and psychological reinforcement for systems of oppression. For enslaved Africans in the Americas, for example, the pale-skinned David and other Europeanized biblical figures served as constant reminders of a world in which they were perceived as inferior, their humanity and spiritual identity systematically denied. By contrast, the authentic David, a man with deep African and Middle Eastern ancestry, represented a narrative of inclusion and shared heritage that was inconvenient to the colonial order. This visual colonization was reinforced by textual and educational tools. Illustrated Bibles, catechisms, and devotional manuals circulated widely in Europe's colonial holdings, presenting a homogeneous image of biblical history. These publications standardized the European David, depicting him alongside other white biblical heroes, creating a seamless visual language that linked divinity, morality, and European identity. In classrooms, churches, and community gatherings, indigenous and enslaved populations internalized these images as normative and authoritative. The historical realities of the Levant, the Canaanites, the Moabites, and the Afro-Levantine context of David's lineage were erased from consciousness, replaced by a narrative tailored to serve European political and cultural interests. The whitewashed David also influenced the global imagination through art and literature in ways that extended far beyond ecclesiastical or colonial settings. European painters and writers exported their interpretations to the New World through visual culture that combined biblical narrative with local allegory, civic pride, and nationalist identity. David became a template for heroism, courage, and righteous rule, but always in the image of the European ideal. Whether depicted slaying Goliath, playing the harp, or standing in victorious defiance, David's features mirrored those of Renaissance and Baroque Europe, leaving little room for the recognition of his Afro-Levantine reality. This constructed image was deeply internalized in Western culture and became self-perpetuating. Artists, scholars, and religious leaders continued to replicate and adapt the European David because it resonated with established ideals of beauty, virtue, and authority. Each new depiction, each new translation, each new sermon reinforced the association between whiteness and divine favor. Over centuries, these layers of reinforcement embedded themselves into global consciousness, making the European David appear not just natural, but inevitable. The erasure of his authentic identity became invisible, a historical given that required no justification. Yet, the evidence of David's historical and ethnic reality persisted quietly in other forms. Biblical texts continued to identify his multi-ethnic lineage, with prominent inclusion of women such as Rahab the Canaanite and Ruth the Moabite. Linguistic analysis of the term Edmoni, describing his skin tone, continued to point to a reddish-brown complexion consistent with the peoples of the Levant. Archaeological discoveries, including the Tel Dan stele, confirmed his historical existence in a region that was a crossroads of African and Asian civilizations. These pieces of evidence, while less visually immediate than marble sculptures or European paintings, provided a powerful corrective to centuries of visual and ideological distortion. The movement to reclaim David's authentic heritage has been slow but deliberate. Scholars in biblical studies, archaeology, and anthropology have revisited ancient texts, revising translations and interpretations to reflect historical and geographic reality. Linguists emphasize the proper reading of Edmoni, placing David firmly in the context of the Levant's earthy, reddish-brown soil. Archaeologists point to genetic and cultural evidence showing that the southern Levant was a melting pot of African, Semitic, and Mediterranean peoples, making a European David an anachronism. These efforts combine textual, linguistic, and material evidence to reconstruct a historically plausible image of the biblical king. Art has also become a critical avenue for reclaiming David's heritage. Contemporary artists and historians are producing visual narratives that challenge the centuries of Europeanization, depicting David in ways that reflect his Afro-Levantine identity. Paintings, illustrations, and digital media now show him with darker skin, Middle Eastern features, and the physicality consistent with a Levantine warrior and shepherd. This artistic reclamation is not merely aesthetic, it is a corrective act, reintroducing visibility and historical accuracy to a figure whose identity has been co-opted and distorted. These new representations also have a profound cultural resonance, allowing people of African and Middle Eastern descent to see themselves reflected in one of history's most celebrated figures. Reclaiming David's heritage is also about confronting broader issues of representation and historical narrative. It exposes how art, theology, and ideology have been used to construct racial hierarchies and justify power structures. By analyzing the European whitewashing of David, we recognize patterns of cultural appropriation and historical distortion that extend to other figures and eras. The process highlights the importance of critically examining visual culture, questioning inherited narratives, and seeking historical authenticity. Importantly, reclaiming David's identity does not diminish his significance in Christian, Jewish, or broader cultural contexts. Rather, it enriches our understanding of his legacy. Recognizing him as a man of the Afro-Levantine world emphasizes the universality of his story, of courage, faith, leadership, and creativity. It underscores that the divine narrative in which he participates transcends race, geography, and politics. By returning David to his historical context, we recover a figure whose life and story resonate across cultures, embodying both historical truth and shared human experience. The impact of reclaiming David extends beyond scholarship and art. It challenges society's broader understanding of history and identity. For communities historically marginalized by European-centric narratives, seeing David authentically represented can serve as a source of empowerment, affirmation, and connection to a shared heritage. It also provides a corrective to centuries of miseducation, offering a fuller, more accurate perspective on biblical history and human civilization. By acknowledging the complex, multi-ethnic reality of figures like David, we cultivate a more inclusive understanding of the past and its ongoing influence on the present. Moreover, this reclamation intersects with global discussions about race, representation, and historical justice. It highlights how narratives, images, and interpretations are shaped by power, and how they, in turn, shape perceptions of identity and belonging. The story of David reminds us that history is never neutral. It is constantly constructed, contested, and rewritten. Recognizing the biases and distortions of the past allows us to engage critically with history and participate in the creation of narratives that are more equitable, inclusive, and truthful. Today, digital media, global scholarship, and cross-cultural collaboration are accelerating this reclamation. Online platforms allow historians, artists, and educators to share evidence, reinterpret texts, and present visual representations that challenge entrenched Eurocentric imagery. Documentaries, podcasts, and online courses reach global audiences, exposing millions to a more nuanced understanding of David's heritage. These efforts demonstrate the power of information technology and global communication in correcting centuries-old misconceptions and making historically accurate narratives accessible to everyone. The ongoing dialogue about David's identity also illustrates the dynamic nature of history and memory. While centuries of Europeanization created a dominant narrative, history itself cannot be entirely erased. Evidence, scholarship, and critical thinking continue to uncover the truths that were suppressed, revealing a past far more diverse, interconnected, and complex than traditional depictions suggest. David's story, therefore, is emblematic of broader historical processes, the tension between power and truth, erasure and reclamation, and imagination and evidence. In conclusion, the journey of King David from the Levant to Florence, from marble to illustrated Bibles, from local hero to global icon, tells a story of cultural appropriation, colonial ideology, and the enduring power of visual representation. The Europeanized David, while a masterpiece of art and human imagination, obscured a more historically and ethnically complex reality. By examining archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and historical context, we recover a David who is fully rooted in the Afro-Levantine world, whose lineage and appearance reflect the rich diversity of the ancient Near East. Reclaiming David is an act of historical justice, cultural recognition, and intellectual integrity. It reminds us that history is not static, that identities can be misrepresented or erased, and that recovering the truth requires careful scholarship, critical engagement, and sometimes the courage to challenge centuries of entrenched assumptions. For the first time in hundreds of years, the real David, descendant of Rahab and Ruth, a man of the Levant, a figure of courage, creativity, and faith, can stand before the world, not as a European ideal, but as he truly was, a king of the Afro-Levantine world, a universal figure whose story belongs to everyone. By reclaiming this history, we also reclaim a piece of ourselves, recognizing that the narratives we inherit are not always complete, that the past is more diverse than it has often been portrayed, and that understanding the full complexity of human history enriches our perception of the present. King David's story, long obscured by art, theology, and ideology, emerges once again in its authentic, vibrant, and historically grounded form, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the necessity of historical reclamation.